So, by way of explanation, for you who are from the branch, you catch us during a part of our annual church life together. We do something every year that we call the Jesus season. And it is during the bookend events of Jesus' life. It's between Christmas, his birth, and then Good Friday and Easter, his death and resurrection. So it's usually 2.5 to 3.5 months. And for that period of time, we do some predictable things every year as a church family. We read through one of the 4 Gospels in your Bible together, chapter by chapter, week by week. And then on Sunday morning, I only teach from the Gospels or about Jesus himself. That's all that I do. Sometimes it's about topics that Jesus covered. This year, what we're doing is we're reading through the Gospel of John, and then on Sunday morning, I'm also teaching from the Gospel of John. So, for example, this week, the reading is John chapter 9. And I will, this morning, teach you a little something from the chapter you're about to read this week. And by the way, even if you're from the branch and this is not part of your rhythm, I would highly recommend that at the very least this week you read that chapter. It is, for reasons that I think you'll understand about halfway through the message, one of my favorite chapters, not just in the Gospel of John, but in the entire Bible. And it is a great story. It's long. It's over 40 verses long, and it is one story. And it is the story of the healing of a man who was blind. And in this story, I'm not going to tell you the whole story. We're going to actually focus on the end of the story. You have the man born blind, and he is healed by Jesus. And then the Pharisees, the Jewish religious leaders of Jesus' day, spend the bulk of the chapter investigating what happened. So they pull the blind guy who is now healed into an interrogation cell for the first time, and they ask him, "How did this happen? What happened to you?" And then they're not convinced or they're not satisfied, so they pull his parents in. And his parents are terrified because these leaders have such power in their life. They could get in so much trouble if they just give the wrong answer to these leaders. And so they say, basically, look, we are no longer responsible for this guy. He's over the age of 18. He is an adult. Actually, in their day, it would be the age of 13. And you need to talk to him, not us. And so the Pharisees go back and talk to the healed blind man again. And there, I'm going to tell you, if you read the story, there's a lot of humor and there's a lot of tragedy. And it ends with the Pharisees being so mad at this man who was healed that they throw him out. By which, in using the phrase, John means he's probably banished or excommunicated from his community. The town or the home, the group of people that he'd known his whole life, that second interview with the Pharisees went so badly that he lost it. And then we come to the end of the chapter, where Jesus and the healed blind man and the crowds who saw the miracle and the Pharisees all come together in one final scene. And in that final scene, you realize this was not about the physical healing of a man who was physically blind. Jesus was trying, in this story, to tell us some of the most deep, profound, fundamental spiritual truths that have always been true for every human being who has ever lived. And it has everything to do with your spiritual sight and your spiritual blindness. Midway through that last scene, this is what Jesus says to that group of people who have been the characters in the story to that point, all of whom now are gathered together. And Jesus says, "For judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind." Now, we as American Christians in the 21st century kind of misunderstand that biblical word judgment. So here's how Eugene Peterson, in his paraphrase of the Bible called The Message, writes that verse, and this gets the first part of that verse much clearer than just the word judgment. He renders it, Jesus then said, I came into the world to bring everything into the clear light of day, making all distinctions clear, so that those who have never seen will see, and those who have made a great pretense of seeing will be exposed as blind. Jesus is saying that the human race has an eyesight problem. Our eyesight problem is not that we see poorly, nor is it that we see well. It's that we think we see well. And he said fundamentally this was the problem with that all of those different groups who were gathered there that day. For the Pharisees, the Jewish religious leaders, this is what they thought. This is how they thought they saw well. They were the most spiritually experienced and learned people in the land. If anybody knew the answer from the Bible, it was going to be them. If you had a vexing or perplexing spiritual question in your life, if you didn't know what to do in any particular situation, the people you would go seek out were the equivalent of your pastor today, called the Pharisees. They ran the synagogues, which are the little religious communities dotted all over the Roman province of Palestine. They thought they saw well because they knew a lot, because they were held in such high esteem. These were the people of all people you would think would have the answer to your question, would be the paragon of spiritual wisdom. And yet Jesus says they are guilty of thinking they see too well. The crowd who was gathered there listening in had seen the blind man healed. They were no less guilty of this. They thought that guy was beyond any human being's and certainly God's ability to help. He was blind his entire life. He was going to be resigned to the life of a blind man in that day, which was far worse than anyone who's disabled this day. He was going to be resigned to being a beggar and hoping that the generosity of strangers would be enough every day that maybe he'd get to eat. And the crowds knew. They knew that this man was beyond hope, and the best that they could do for him is give him a little spare change once in a while, so maybe he'd get to eat. And they too have an eyesight problem. They thought they saw too well. And Jesus comes into the world, he says, to show you that the things you think you see well, you don't. And in fact, maybe worse, the things you think you see really well are actually blindness. Now, maybe as I describe this, you will feel something that I felt when I'm working on interpreting this passage correctly and understanding what Jesus is driving at. This is a very disconcerting idea to me. It is a little unnerving, frankly. Here's why. Aren't all of us supposed to be spending our lives and our decades as human beings, and yes, as followers of Jesus, trying to get a little bit wiser every day, every week, every month? Aren't we supposed to be maturing and getting better at this thing? Aren't we supposed to be seeing clearer and clearer and being more and more transformed the further we go in the faith? Isn't that what's supposed to be happening? I think so. And yet Jesus says, no matter who you are, from the highest Pharisee who knows the most, from the most respected person in the community, down to a man that nobody thinks God can heal, everyone is susceptible to this particular malady of the human race. We think we see too well. And the more you think you see, probably the worse off your vision is. That's a scary thought. Now, you don't have to do it out loud, but I want you to think for a minute. Where in your life do you think you see well? Now, I don't mean that with visual acuity, but as a human being, as a follower of Jesus, where do you see well? What have you got figured out? What in your life to you seems crystal clear? You've made your mind up, you've wiped your hands, and you're done with that. You can file it away in the out box on your mental desk. Where in your life is that true? What do you believe that you think you're never going to have to doubt again? Who do you think in your life is worthy of your love, and who do you think in your life isn't? Who are the kind of people that you want to be friends with, and who are the kind of people that you don't? What's the kind of behavior that will turn you away from someone, and when do you feel justified in doing so? These are answers that we all have and carry around with us day after day after day. And eventually we get to where we don't even question those things. We see them clearly. We're sure we're right. And then Jesus comes and upsets the entire apple cart. One of the greatest dangers you and I face is to live our lives thinking we see well. Because the more we think we see well, the less Jesus can change what you see. This was the great error of all those gathered that day. Here's the antidote then that Jesus would provide for you and I who have an eyesight problem, who are just a little too sure of what we think, what we see, who we are, and how we treat others. Jesus says it is far better to go through your life knowing that you're blind. Because when you know that you're blind, you're open to somebody outside of yourself helping you see. Now, I told you this is one of my favorite passages in all the Bible. Here's why. I'm visually handicapped. And I would wager to you, I read this story and understand it differently than most of you who aren't. And that's why this spiritual truth, it resonates with me deeply, because I live this experience every day of my life. I was born totally blind, and then, story I'm not going to tell you today, when I was 18 months old, I became legally blind. I gained a little sight. My right eye is still legally blind, even when it's corrected. My left eye is my good eye. It's why I actually get to drive a car. Somebody somewhere in the bureaucracy of America thought that if I have one decent eye, then I can drive a motor vehicle. If you give me your cell phones after the service, I will text you when I'm on the street near you, and you can choose to not be driving around. I get this. I get what Jesus is saying here. Here's how I get this. If my mom and dad were up here and you were talking to them about the experience of raising a significantly visually handicapped person or child, they would tell you one of the greatest hurdles that I faced and they faced as my parents is that I didn't want to act like I was handicapped. I didn't want anyone to know. And if you don't know somebody in your life, be it a child or a teenager or a college person or an adult near you who has a handicap or a mental illness, I'm going to tell you something about them by telling you my story. They don't want you to know. And they're going to do everything they can to fake you out. So, in elementary school and even through junior high and early high school, my parents pleaded with me, would you please sit in the front of the class so you can see the chalkboard? Because here's the thing. I can see Chris DeBlay and Bethany DeBlay sitting right there. After that, I have no idea who you are. I see people. I don't know who you are. Okay? Well, this was an educational hurdle for me because I had to sit in the front row. But none of my friends wanted to sit in the front row, right? They all wanted to sit in the back of the class so they could cut up and write notes and mark their desk up and all that kind of stuff. Well, that's where I wanted to sit. So I did. And my parents, every day I'd come home and say, did you sit in the front of the class so you could see the chalkboard? Nope. I didn't. So I got real good at listening. I had no idea what the teacher's writing on the chalkboard, but I listened well enough that when he called on me in class, I could tell him the answer to the problem just because I'd heard it in my head and figured it out. I'm really bad at eye contact. I have to be thinking about it consciously, even as a 47-year-old man. to make eye contact with people, because the way you can tell I'm visually handicapped is my eyes. They move all the time, and they can't focus on anything. And I'm sure, yes, if you've spent any time with me or we've gone to Big B or whatever, you've picked up on that. Well, I know you pick up on that. And let me just go ahead and tell you, I don't want you to notice. And I certainly didn't when I was a child and a teenager. So I just wouldn't look people in the eye. I didn't want them to tell. And one of the great ways that I have had to grow as a person is I've had to own the fact over the course of my life that I'm visually handicapped, and there is no change in it. And I have to own that every time I meet somebody for the rest of my life, one of the very first things they're going to notice about me is that my eyes don't work right, and they're going to see it. And I assure you that having lived for over 4 decades with that knowledge that everybody's going to notice your inferiority or imperfection very quickly is a hard thing to live with. But I get what Jesus means here. You have to own the fact that you're blind. So, by the time I got to postgraduate school, actually, as I work on my doctorate, one of the legendary classes in my particular field was you had to read 10,000 pages of literature in one semester. 10,000 pages. I want you to think about that. That's a whole lot of books that are this big or bigger. And I knew I couldn't do it. Here's one of the little peculiarities of my handicap. I can only read for about an hour or an hour and a half, and then I get blinding headaches because it's just too much strain on my eyes. And so I had to walk hand in hand, hat in hand, to my professor in this class and tell him, look, if you don't give me more time, or we can't figure out a way to stretch this out, I'm done. And I'm going to have migraines the entire semester. Now, the good news is, the older I get, the easier it is to ask for help like that. This is why God gave me kids, among other things. If I'm driving around with my kids, one of my kids is always sitting in the front seat because Dad can't read street signs. So I'm the guy on Google Maps. When you tell me to come over to your house or whatever, I'm counting, okay, so it's the third right after this intersection. And that's how I get around. And if I've never been to your house before, odds are I'm going to be late because I blew it. And once I blew it, then I'm toast. Once I get off my map, I'm done. But God gave me kids. And now, when I go someplace new, I always try to have either Eli or Shiloh in the front seat with me because they know that Dad needs their help to read street signs. And when they're not on their phone or their iPad, they're really, really good help for me. I get what Jesus means here. Every human being you know, including you, doesn't see very well. And most of us spend our entire life trying to convince ourselves and others that we have it more together than we really do, that we're more sure of the decisions we're making or the priorities we have or what we believe than we really are. And what Jesus says is you have to get to the point where you own your own blindness. And it doesn't matter how old you are, you never outgrow this. You have to have the humility to say, yeah, I don't get this. I don't quite understand yet. Or this part of my life is a mess. No matter how well I'm doing over here, this part, I am not doing okay. And Jesus says it's exactly where you need to end up. Because it is only then that he can be, as he calls himself earlier in this chapter, the light of the world to you. You have to own the fact that human beings, by their very nature, see far worse than they think they do. And I'm looking at a room full of people who are as visually impaired as I am. I just don't know what about. Now, Jesus continues in this chapter. These are the last 2 verses of the entire chapter, in fact. And he actually gives you a way you can figure out where in your life you may have an eyesight problem, where you're trying really hard to look good or act like you have it all together, but you probably don't. Pharisees, listening into the conversation, said to him, "What? Are we blind too?" Oh, such good writing. Yes, you are. And Jesus says to them, Jesus replied, "If you were blind, you would no longer be guilty of sin. But because you continue to claim that you see, your guilt remains." I'm going to give you something you can carry around with you. If you're curious, where in my life do I think that I see too well? Where am I a little too confident? Where am I a little too sure of myself? You need to look where your life feels heaviest. The word guilt there in the New Testament is a word that has weight with it. It's heavy. So you're meant to feel that weight. So when Jesus says the problem with the Pharisees and others like them in the crowd is that they thought they saw too well, it meant that their sin remained with them. Their guilt remained with them. Their life was heavy. Because of these places, they were choosing to ignore their own blindness. There's a story that comes to mind for me about this. In seminary, pastor's school, one of my favorite teachers was an Old Testament professor. Really, really smart guy, young guy, kind of a rising star in his chosen field of Old Testament studies. And he and I had become friends, and he loved to talk about the different ways in his life that he would apply or use his field of study, the Old Testament, to make his life work the way that God intended in the Scriptures. And so for the first semester I had him, one of the things on occasion he'd talk about is the wisdom of the Old Testament on making your marriage work well. I remember to this day him teaching us Genesis chapter 2, the end of the chapter, about the creation of Adam and Eve and how there in just those few verses you have how you can make a healthy marriage work between a man and a woman. It's a beautiful thing the way that he described it. Then the next semester one day he came into class and his countenance, his face, was noticeably different. It had been obvious he'd been crying. His eyes were rimmed with red. His shoulders were not back. He was not standing upright, confident, as he usually did. He was hunched over, and his face was even a little gray. And he started class by talking about how just that last night, his wife had pulled him aside and said, "I can't take this anymore. I don't know what you think you're doing in our marriage, but let me tell you my opinion about it." And it's like somebody pulled the rug out from underneath him. He thought he was doing great in his marriage. He told us he thought he was doing great in his marriage. And apparently that wasn't the case. He was living proof of what Jesus says here. Often the heaviest, most burdensome parts of your life are the parts where you think you see best, but you don't really. For this guy, it was his marriage, and he'd completely been missing how his wife was lonely, how his wife felt like his job and his profession got far more of his energy and his time than she did. And finally he figured it out because she wouldn't let him live that way anymore. You and I are the same way. There are places in your life where you think you see really, really well. You're convinced that you've got it all together, but you need to listen to the weight of your life, because I'll bet you might have something happen kind of like what happened to my Old Testament professor. There are probably things in your life that you carried in here with you this morning that weigh you down, in fact. don't know what they are. You've been able to make your relationship with 3 or your 4 kids work just fine, and it's that 4th one that is driving you to drink. Or you did great with your daughter when she was a 4th grader. Boy, now that she's a 9th grader, not so much. There's something. There's that one relationship that you can't make work. There's that doubt about God that you carry with you all the time and won't talk about because you're so embarrassed. Surely nobody else doubts like I do. Everybody's life in the room has a weight to it. I just don't know what it is. Here's what I need you to do. Own the fact that you're blind. Because, as the great Martin Luther said in the Reformation, the only sin that God cannot forgive is the one you don't confess. The way I say it to you on the screen is this. Your life is going to be heaviest in the places that you won't admit to God that you're blind. He can't help you if you don't admit it. Stop wandering around like you see really well. Whatever it is for you, stop. Listen to the weightiest part of your life and stop. Stop. And just admit that that's the place where you need God's help the most. This is the lesson of the story of the healed blind man in John chapter 9. These 2 quotes, I think, do a great job of summarizing the human race, folks just like you and me, who, if we're not careful, have a major eyesight problem. This is from an English Christian poet and playwright from the Middle Ages, the Renaissance period. He writes, quote, "There are none so blind as those who will not see. The most deluded people are those who choose to ignore what they already know." And the great American poet Maya Angelou says it this way, much more succinctly. You are only as blind as you want to be. Would you take a minute here at the end of the message this morning? This is something that we here at RiverTree do most Sundays. I end by just pausing. And I put something up on the screen like this, where then you can just pause. And I've been talking about the Bible now, John chapter 9, for 30 minutes. Now you can let God speak to you. I'm not sure what it is that you need to take away from today or what you need to pass on to somebody else, but He does. So pause in the quiet and allow Him to speak to you. Maybe it's time for you to own up to the fact that you don't see very well. It's okay. Maybe it's time for you to give over that weightiest part of your life and admit that that's where you need help. That's where you're blind. I'm not sure. Pause and allow God to speak to you. You speak to Him, and then I'll pray for us all in a moment.